Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a returning guest. His name is Albert Lanier. We talked last month about the strange death of Bobby Fuller in Hollywood. And he's a journalist. He's done a lot of research, and he's covered in the past a story that I'm interested in. A pre-internet story, kind of people have called it the octopus. There's been a couple of books about this whole story that involves software and the strange death of a guy by the name of Danny Casolaro, who was found dead in a hotel room in 1991. And it does tie in. There's all kinds of deep state, would be called deep state type figures. Robert Maxwell, John Tower, and it's just the U.S. Department of Justice, and ties in vaguely with a lot of people involved in Iran-Contra, which is how it got the name the octopus. But Albert can talk more about that. So, Albert, welcome back to the show.
It's nice to be back.
For people who may not have heard of our earlier interview, can you kind of talk about your background and then how you became interested in the whole story of INSLAW and PROMIS?
Oh, sure. Well, I was first on this program to discuss the death of rock star Bobby Fuller. And we had a discussion about that, examination of that, and some of the lingering questions, because it was so rather odd death. For one reason, Fuller was found in his mother's car, having taken his mother's car previously the night before. And the car was driven back with him in it, with his dead body in it. And his body was doused in gasoline. And there wasn't really a proper investigation done about Bobby Fuller. So I investigated, or I talked about, not only some of the lingering questions, but the sort of lingering and residual mystery of the Bobby Fuller case. My background is as a freelance journalist, a print journalist, having written for newspapers and magazines, and as a freelance writer. I also became a ghostwriter, 2014 or so, a number of years into my career, and I remain a ghostwriter to this day. But I was a freelance writer and journalist largely from 1994 until about 2017 when I retired, February 2017 when I retired. I wrote for a number of publications, among them Honolulu Weekly, Pacific Business News, Asian Week, and Hawaii Magazine, and numerous other publications. And I wrote a blog for about 4 years after I retired called, was just under my name. It was on medium.com, and it was about media and, current events, current news. So, and that brings us basically back up to where we are today. And part of the reason I'm here is I'm promoting my, my official YouTube channel, because that's I think it's one of the few places I haven't really had a presence in as a writer. So unfortunately, when you're a writer, I still remain a writer, even though I'm retired as a journalist and a freelancer. As a writer, you got to market and promote yourself, which I'm not a fan of, but it's part of whatever trade you're in as a writer. So you can, I just started my official YouTube channel. It's known as Writer Albert Lanier. And that's, again, part of the reason I'm here. The other part, of course, is to talk about not only Danny Casolaro, who himself was a freelance writer, but also the INSLAW and the octopus, as I call it. I call it INSLAW octopus. And I will say, incidentally, I wrote a piece about INSLAW and octopus for my blog. It was called Labyrinth. So I hope that fills people in a bit as to who I am and what I'm talking about.
Gotcha. And where does it all start? Where did the whole INSLAW PROMIS octopus, where did it begin?
Okay, so why don't we start then with PROMIS? For those who are unfamiliar with PROMIS, since that, if we're looking at Danny Casolaro, that was essentially what led him, or eventually led him, into what was known as the octopus, right? Get into a little later. So PROMIS stands for Prosecutor Management Information System. Now, essentially what PROMIS was designed as, or basically designed and marketed as, was case management information. Now, I have to confess, I'm not a tech guy, so I'll do the best I can here. I'm sure there are people who are better at technology than I am, and better with computers and software and hardware and all that. But so forgive me if I do not sound like a tech geek or tech guy as I talk about a little of this at times. Now, basically, as I mentioned before, PROMIS, Prosecutors Management Information System, was kind of designed as case management information, basically for U.S. attorneys or federal prosecutors' offices. It was part of a contract with the DOJ, Department of Justice, Federal Department of Justice. Now, PROMIS was designed and created by a man named William Hamilton. Now, Hamilton himself had a background initially working, I believe, as a contractor. He was, I think, from the research that I looked up, what I looked up about him, Hamilton had initially, or at some point, had been working on listening posts in Vietnam that were used to keep track of North Vietnamese, Viet Cong. And so he was hired, I think, as a full-scale NSA employee. I think he may have been a contractor at one point, but he was hired by NSA. He was a former employee of the NSA. NSA being the National Security Agency. Basically, well, I don't know if I should note the nickname for the NSA was, which was no such agency. But the NSA is what I would call a surveillance agency, right? Known for their computer systems. They're important, I think, also in light of Edward Snowden, right? Because he was a contractor. So that's
PROMIS
very
was the
significant.
forerunner. PROMIS was the forerunner of the NSA's PRISM. So going back
Right.
into the 80s and 90s right now.
Right. And it was a forerunner of a lot of other systems, I would say. PROMIS was essentially breakthrough, but you wouldn't have thought that from its initial package, because again, and I have to stress this, it was supposed to be used as case management software. That's what it was technically designed for. Now, Hamilton himself, employee for NSA, he comes up with the idea, a concept for PROMIS. And initially, and here's where I'll try to break this down a bit. There essentially were two kinds of PROMIS, right? There was the initial PROMIS software that was developed under the auspices of the NSA, right? Now, this was funded and supported by a grant from the LEAA, which is Law Enforcement Assistance Administration. This was kind of a program that assisted and helped. I think it was affiliated with the DOJ. This came up, I think, during the Carter administration, the 70s. Now, the LEAA eventually got rescinded by Congress. So what happened was that Hamilton ended up buying a company called INSLAW, right? Mm-hmm. And the institute, INSLAW being the Institute for, I think it's Social Law and Research. And I think he bought that in the early 80s, if I'm not mistaken. So it was in the early 80s. And what he was looking to do was work on a more advanced version of PROMIS which was known as enhanced PROMIS. So let's break that down. The initial version that he was working on, let's call that primary PROMIS, right? The second version was enhanced PROMIS. And what this was going to be part of was he was going to use INSLAW, and was setting that up as a company for which he would market and license and sell PROMIS software, right? The enhanced PROMIS. Okay. So essentially, he was departing from the NSA. He was involved with his company, his new company, INSLAW. And he was going to be involved in taking his software and essentially making this enhanced PROMIS proprietary software. Now, notice before I stated that PROMIS was developed under the auspices of the federal government. So while he was still an employee with the NSA.
Okay.
Now, clearly, I'm sure that it could be argued, not just by me, but by others, that the government was not happy, or that there were people in the government that were not happy with the situation. One, because this was set up while Hamilton was still an employee of the federal government. And now he was doing, which is not unusual when you look at a lot of, I would say, a lot of products that you see were developed in the public sector and then had applications. The technology or the basic application, basic aspects were used as products, right? Now,
Right.
I think something that's brought out seems silly, but it's brought out is like Tang, for instance. Tang, I think, was
Right.
developed for astronauts, I believe.
You're right. That's what
that later became a commercial marketed beverage. So he was taking this enhanced PROMIS, and he was going to sell it under the auspices and license it on the auspices of INSLAW, right? And what Hamilton decided to do was conduct a contract with the Department of Justice. And so the Department of Justice became the early client for INSLAW and obviously for the PROMIS software. And the application in selling this to the federal government, and specifically the DOJ, was to, again, U.S. attorneys' offices, federal prosecutors' office, to help with their management of cases. Right?
Right.
Right. So there was a contract, as I mentioned, that was conducted. And the contract was supposed to be a 3-year contract. From what I understand, about $10 million. Hamilton and INSLAW were paid the first installment. I think it probably was maybe over, I'm trying to remember. It was 10 million. I think it may have been over 3 million per installment. The first installment was paid, but then no further monies were paid to the Hamiltons and were paid to INSLAW. And so this became a problem because the Hamiltons ended up getting stiffed by the federal government. And essentially what happened was that the federal government, and this was later brought out, what happened was that the Hamiltons were forced into bankruptcy because, you know, they had a client that had stiffed them on their contract and the client wasn't paying.
Right.
And so they're trying to, you know, market their software, and they're trying to get this software. Now, let me just go back a little and talk about why PROMIS was significant, why it was important, because I think that's important to know. At that point, when Hamilton was developing the PROMIS software in the 70s, about mid 70s or late 70s and early 80s, what you had in regards to computer databases were databases that could not really interface or interact with each other. So from what I understand, if you had a specific computer database in a government agency or for a company, that database could be used by whatever employees or whatever workers could tap into it. But you couldn't use that database to interact with any other database. So if you are, say, working for, I don't know what it would be, the IRS, you can't go and use your database to go and look up aspects related to, I don't know what it would be, the FBI or other kinds of databases. So the databases were basically standalone. And again, I'm not a tech guy. I'm trying to.
Right. This is before the internet. These are before the
Right.
whole connectivity. This is early 80s, early to mid 80s.
Mm-hmm. So there was no connectivity. There was no interfacing. There was no interactivity between databases. And so that was kind of an issue. So what needed to be developed were, I believe the term is relational databases. And so you had companies that were trying relational databases. That is, databases that could interface and interact with other databases. What PROMIS represented and what PROMIS was, it turned out to be the best relational database available. And the reason this was the case was not only could it, as per case management information software, take cases and file them away neatly and, you know, allow for people access to information, go to a file, look up the file, see it. But once it was worked on, once it was tinkered with, once it was reconfigured, PROMIS could there become very powerful software. And this is where it gets, this is where it got interesting. And this was the reason why not only the federal government, but other kinds of governments and their intelligence agencies were interested in PROMIS. Once you could reconfigure PROMIS, you could use it to basically have software that could track individuals, that could track accounts like bank accounts, that could track other kinds of items. Very powerful when you're talking about, again, late 70s, early 80s. And as you mentioned before, the fact there was no internet. I mean, you had DARPA and you had the internet that was being developed, but you didn't have an internet that had any public use or commercial use, and it wasn't available. And again, what computers could do in regards to databases were limited because they couldn't interact. No interactivity, no interfacing between this database and that database and this system and that system.
Okay. So what was PROMIS? What happened with PROMIS and INSLAW? INSLAW thought that somebody stole their software, right? The DOJ.
Right. Well, in essence, that's what essentially happened. As I mentioned before, the Hamiltons ended up being bankrupt. The company ended up bankrupt. So, excuse me. What occurred was that they ended up in U.S. bankruptcy court. because what Hamilton did was file a lawsuit against the DOJ. And the case went to federal bankruptcy court in 1987. And a judge by the name of George Basin ruled against the Department of Justice. And for him, and he was interviewed on, and people can look up the interview. He was interviewed on the Australian program, A Current Affair. They did a segment about the PROMIS software and I think the death of Casolaro, not so much the octopus, but the death of Casolaro and PROMIS, primarily PROMIS. And so Basin was interviewed on that program, and people should check it out if they want to see him being interviewed. But Basin noted, I believe in his decision, that PROMIS was basically obtained, I would call snatched and stolen, but obtained through, quote, trickery, fraud, and deceit. Those are the words that were used. And I think for Basin, it was pretty clear based on, I believe it was the evidence at hand, not only what employees I think were saying, but also what documents, what some of the documents that he was able to ascertain or look at. So unfortunately, what happened after that is the Court of Appeals in DC reversed the case. So what happened is that Basin had awarded, I think it was anywhere between, that I've seen, about 6.8 or about 8 million. I've heard 8 million, but I've also seen 6.8 million. So I'll just say $6 to $8 million in damages to the Hamiltons, right? Unfortunately, the Court of Appeals in DC reversed the decision. And I believe the decision was reversed because of a legal technicality. I think they argued that the bankruptcy court did not have jurisdiction to hear the case, which strikes me as interesting considering that it went to trial and the court ruled, but
yeah, they won. Basically,
that was the decision.
Won.
Yes, in the bankruptcy court. And then they had the case reversed by the DC Court of Appeals. I mean, it's one of a number of things. I would call it reversal of fortune. That's a good way to put it. But I would say it's one of the aspects of reversal of fortune in this, how do I put this, saga?
No, it's a saga.
In this Saturday. Yeah.
So what happened next? I mean, so how does Casolaro tie into this whole scheme?
Okay.
What happened with PROMIS?
Okay. So what happened was that Casolaro himself, his background was I think he's originally from Virginia, and Casolaro was someone who was interested in writing. You know, that was his interest. I think literature to a certain extent, but writing. He was basically a college dropout, and Casolaro himself wound up getting involved in computers. He owned a computer publication. I believe, make sure that I have the right name of it, but
yeah, he went through a variety of. Somebody said that he was even a poet, like in one of the articles that I read today. But he eventually ended up owning a computer company, like not a computer, but a computer magazine or something.
Right. Yeah, he owned a computer publication very early on. You're talking about early on in the 80s. And I think he ended up selling that publication because he ended up getting back into writing. He became freelancer and he ended up getting into freelance journalism. And so he ended up getting back into writing. Now, I actually wanted to ask you a little something, if you don't mind.
No.
You had mentioned that you had read a couple articles about Casolaro. What's your take on Casolaro? Because I don't know. I know you're interested in this affair.
Murdered.
What was
he was murdered? He was murdered in a hotel room over something in Martinsburg, which really isn't that far outside of D.C. It's probably a very good place. People get killed outside of D.C. all the time. I lived there for 3 years. So I think that he was finding something sensitive. And I think they probably warned him to go away, and he didn't. Because he supposedly committed suicide by cutting his wrists like 15 times on each wrist. It's very un-male, too, which is weird.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was curious of what you thought of him as a person, because you were telling me a little about the article that you read. So I'm just curious about that.
He was probably just a journalist looking for stories, just like anybody else. He probably wrote other stories, and then he realized this is a fascinating story with a lot of different things going on, because there's interesting characters. Reconasciuto, there was the Cabazon Indians, so you had kind of like another jurisdiction. You had Wackenhut. There was another guy whose name escapes me now. Very kind of suspicious character. So there's definitely like an underworld that he was looking into. So, what did you think about him?
Well, my impression of Casolaro was that he was a guy. He struck me as a guy who not so much was out of his depth, but I don't think he understood what he was dealing with. And I don't know that I've ever talked about him as a person when the couple times I've been interviewed about him, but I never got the sense that he understood. He had death threats against him, and he knew that. He told his brother that, because his brother was a doctor. I think his father and his brother were both doctors, both physicians. And he had told his brother, according to what his brother had stated, that I've been getting death threats, and people want me to get away from this subject and move away and not mess with it. And so he clearly understood, I think, the ramifications of working on not so much the PROMIS affair, but what he termed the octopus. I think he understood it. I think he got it. But I don't know that he was able to see it in the larger context. That's my impression of it. That's my impression. I think he struck me as a well-meaning writer, but he was involved in a situation that was way out of his depth, I think. And I think he did a good job, but I think he was way out of his depth. And I don't mean that. That's why I was hesitant to say that, because I'm not trying to put down Danny, who I have respect for. That's part of the reason I agreed to be interviewed about him. But I do feel he was out of his depth to a certain extent. I don't think he realized the extent of how deep this went. And to be fair, I think a number of people in his position might not have either, to be fair with you.
Right, but I mean, his research didn't just pertain to INSLAW, PROMIS, and these things. He had a much broader, wider thing. He was looking into former CIA officers, arms dealers. So he had gone. This was almost like an entryway into the underworld, which still exists to this day. But it was.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, it does. Yeah, you're right. It was a gate. What happened was that the PROMIS affair and the INSLAW case were gateways to what I would say was the octopus for Danny Casolaro. It brought him into all of these threads relating to government, to some extent organized crime, to some extent intelligence operatives and operations. And it really became, he really became enmeshed. And I think that's why he was trying, in my view, he was trying to understand this rather complex web. I mean, he called it the octopus. I call it the web. because that's what I think it was. This strand here, that strand there, that strand there, that strand there. And unfortunately, someone came along and just destroyed the web with him in it.
Right.
Sad.
I mean, he was talking to that guy Riconosciuto, right? Can you talk about Michael Riconosciuto? Do you know about him?
Yes, Michael Riconosciuto. If you look into this, case, you can't help but talk about Riconosciuto or know a little about him. From my understanding, Riconosciuto was like a kind of technical scientific prodigy when he was a kid, like very highly intelligent. Now, the reason why Riconosciuto, or Michael Riconosciuto, is mentioned in regards to PROMIS is what happened was, as I mentioned before, the Hamiltons had taken the federal government, the DOJ, to court. They won the case, but they lost in terms of appeals, right? What happened was that the House Judiciary Committee, under the leadership of Democrat Jack Brooks, started looking into the PROMIS software affair, or the PROMIS affair, and into INSLAW. In fact, in 1992, they conducted hearings. Jack Brooks's Judiciary Committee had conducted hearings on what was termed, from what I'm reading here, sorry, I'm looking at some notes, I hope you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
The INSLAW affair, to state it directly. Right. And so Jack Brooks was the chair. Now, I think with the Judiciary Committee, Brooks had conducted like a 3-year investigation into INSLAW. And so when I first started looking into INSLAW and PROMIS and the octopus, one of the things that I read was the hearing report, the report of the hearings, the Judiciary Committee report on the INSLAW affair. So that I had read years ago. I think I may have looked at it maybe a few years ago as well. But that was part of my initial research when I looked into INSLAW. So what happened was they were holding these hearings, and Riconosciuto had contacted Hamilton and asked to be, and informed him of what was going on. Now, basically where Riconosciuto comes in is this. Riconosciuto was supposedly hired to take the PROMIS software. So let's go back a little. We know that the Hamiltons were screwed out of payment for the PROMIS software. Why is that the case? Because the DOJ wanted the software. The NSA was interested in it as well, but the federal government in general was interested in the software, right? And we're talking the early 80s here, right? So this is under the auspices of the Reagan administration. And anybody who's looked into any aspect of the Reagan administration knows that that administration was an administration of operatives and operators, in my view. Or as George Carlin put it once in his stand-up routine, Ronald Reagan and his criminal gang. So this was under the auspices of the Reagan administration. Essentially, again, if we look at what Judge Basin had stated in the federal bankruptcy court hearing, PROMIS was essentially stolen from the Hamiltons through trickery, fraud, and deceit. And so if we're aware of that, what the DOJ and the federal government in general were doing was essentially pirating and using PROMIS for themselves. And what's more important, as we'll also get into, is that they were looking to sell the software to other countries, primarily to intelligence agencies.
Okay, and then what happens next?
Okay, so Riconosciuto, we then enter Riconosciuto. He contacts the Hamiltons when you have these judiciary hearings that are going to come up in 1992, right? And Riconosciuto tells the Hamiltons, meaning William Hamilton and his wife Nancy, who were the owners of INSLAW. What Riconosciuto tells them is that he was hired to modify the PROMIS software. Now, what this basically consisted of was taking the software and installing what was known as a backdoor routine. I believe it would be password protected. So this backward would allow anyone with the right code to then access the software and read what was in the files of the software and what's in the body of the program. Riconosciuto stated he had done this on Cabazon Indian Reservation land and at the Cabazon Indian Reservation in Indio, California. That's like I believe that's the Coachella Valley.
Right.
They have that music festival there, Coachella. So that is what Riconosciuto had stated in terms of his involvement. He was hired to modify the software and to install this backdoor and to install, which would allow access to every part of PROMIS. Now, why is this significant? Well, because once you alter, as I mentioned before about PROMIS, if you alter the software, if you use it in a certain way, you can use it to track various kinds of people, accounts, items, all kinds of things, right? That was the importance of PROMIS, that this was maybe designed as case management information, but because it would technically be software that could interface with other databases, and it was relational software that worked, it was really important because it was a breakthrough piece of software. It was a breakthrough computer product. So,
okay, and then what happened?
All right. So Riconosciuto agrees to state, all this in an affidavit and have his affidavit be part of the investigation. I'm not quite sure. I don't recall whether he was going to testify or not, but he certainly did file an affidavit or write an affidavit. Now, what happened was the Riconosciuto then ended up being arrested. Not only arrested, but convicted eventually on charges of, I believe it's creating and distributing methamphetamine. So basically, he was arrested by authorities, by federal authorities, police federal authorities, and he was eventually put in prison. So you have Riconosciuto, whose importance is that he changed the software on Cabazon Indian Reservation in Indio, California. The reason it was done there was because as a reservation, it would be sovereign territory, sovereign land outside the purview of the federal government. Now you have Riconosciuto, who made an affidavit and was doing this, I guess, to help the Hamiltons. He's now out of the way. So that's another thing that goes wrong when we look at, PROMIS, INSLAW, Octopus. Again, we look at the Hamiltons. They're screwed out of payments by the DOJ and federal government. They end up in bankruptcy. They have to file suit. We see Riconosciuto, who says he was involved in modifying the software and in doing that on sovereign territory and changing aspects of the software for its use, what eventually became its sales use. And he ends up being arrested and put in prison. So things seem to go wrong when it comes to INSLAW, PROMIS, and the Octopus, it seems.
Right. So there's all problems with the octopus, but Casolaro's dead. But there was an inquest into his death through the government, right?
Right. So that's great. Eventually, now let me just get to the death of Danny Casolaro. Now, as I mentioned before, Danny he was a guy that had a computer publication. He is the owner of a computer publication, and he ended up selling that. So he had a background in regards to computers, right? Interest in it, at least. And he ended up getting wind of the INSLAW affair, right? He ended up hearing about it. I think he'd probably been tipped off about it. And so he started reporting on and doing work investigating INSLAW affair, right? And
Right.
what eventually happened was, in looking at INSLAW, he started looking at other aspects. For example, when you look at PROMIS, the scuttlebutt is, or the belief is, that PROMIS was sold to, for example, Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with BCCI. That was a major scandal in the 1990s.
Yes, I've done a show on that. I've done a show on BCCI.
Right. And so what Casolaro ended up getting into were it's what I call aspects of the web, right? This strand goes here, that strand goes there, that strand goes there. So he ended up finding out about what he termed to be the octopus. That was his name for it. The octopus was ostensibly this organization, basically a former intelligence operative, former members of intel agencies. That was essentially what the octopus was. Or I would say, even to this day, may possibly still be. So he started moving from just investigating and looking into INSLAW into what became all the other permutations of the octopus. And so the octopus was this organization that was involved ostensibly in all kinds of shadowy and covert operations in various countries. And so what you're seeing is this progression from Casolaro. He's investigating what's going on with INSLAW. He's seeing what's going on with his computer theft, and that gets him involved in investigating other aspects. And he eventually gets to the octopus. And so what happens is he gets more and more interested in the octopus. In fact, he was going to write this as a novel. I believe he was going to write it as a novel. He certainly put in I think he had tried, selling it as a novel to a publisher. I think it was Little Brown. But he tried, certainly, I think it was called Behold the Pale Horse. And some of the aspects, some of the strands of this were, I think, talked about in a book publication or a book proposal. And that didn't really go anywhere. But Casolaro was looking to write a book about this, from my understanding. And what happened was he ended up in Martinsburg, West Virginia in 1991. And he was at a hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia. I believe it was the Sheraton Hotel. And that was unfortunately where he was found dead. His wrists had been slashed anywhere for about a dozen times. Several slashes on one wrist and arm, and several slashes on another. Now, why is this significant? Because Casolaro himself was very, very squeamish when it came to blood. He was somebody who did not want to even get a blood test. That is what his relatives, his family members have said. So he was somebody who just didn't want to be around the sight of blood, I think, let alone have any blood taken from him. So it stands to reason that if you're squeamish, if you're somebody who can't really deal with blood, why would you choose a way of committing suicide that involves bleeding? And not only that, but bleeding to death. It's not logical. It certainly doesn't make any coherent, rational sense. But unfortunately, when it comes to a number of deaths in this country, coherent and rational are not terms that are often applied or used. So it's very unfortunate. So he was found in this Sheraton hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Now, Martinsburg, West Virginia is outside of DC. And I had been interviewed on a show, about a decade ago. And I was told that Martinsburg has a number of branches or offices of federal agencies, if I'm not mistaken. At least that's what I was told. Now, from what I understand, Casolaro was there to see someone at an IRS center. And he was there looking to get copies of hard copy data that he could use in this case. He had also supposedly met with a William Turner, who was someone who had worked, I believe, for a defense contractor, and they had met. And then you have a kind of, according to, I believe it was a waitress in the hotel, Casolaro was seen with a man of, gotta be careful here, a man who is said to be of Arab persuasion. And we don't really hear much about that aspect, but that was one of the aspects that was stated about Casolaro not long before he was found dead. So Casolaro was there for a couple of days. He was there in Martinsburg, West Virginia. But yeah, when it comes to his death, the first suspicious aspect is that his wrists were slashed about a dozen times, that his arm was slashed, right? Again, man was reportedly squeamish about blood, afraid of blood, didn't want anything to do with blood, according to his family and his relatives. Yet this is what he's found. He's found slashed wrists, slashed arms, and he's found also in the bathroom of his room in a tub of bloody water. Now, again, here we have a guy who, again, afraid of blood, but he's going to not only slash his wrist and his arms, but be in a tub of water filled with blood. And supposedly beneath, he was found, I think there had been a liner underneath him. There was a razor blade. I think there were a couple of beer cans or something that was found in that tub as well. So when you look at the situation in regards to the crime scene, and I'll call it a crime scene because I believe he was murdered, you look at these details, they don't really add up as a suicide. There were also reportedly bloody towels that were found on the floor of the bathroom. Again, bloody towels. So again, let's try to use some logic here. Casolaro is going to commit suicide, right?
Right.
He's going to use a razor blade or some such blade, slash his arms several times, slash his wrists several times. Now, also, it should also be noted, I believe this was the coroner's report, it was noted that he not only slashed his wrist, slashed his arm, but he slashed it down beneath the dermis and supposedly hit the tendon. So we're talking about something that was a very solid slash. We're not talking about something that was a hesitation. My understanding, when people try to commit suicide by slitting wrist, there are hesitation marks, right? These weren't hesitation marks. They seemed to be devastation marks, meaning they wanted to kill Casolaro. And when you add all this up, none of it really seems to make sense. A guy who's squeamish about blood, but he decides to slash his wrists. A guy who's afraid, not very comfortable in terms of blood, but he's going to be found in the tub of bloody water. A guy who is certainly finds blood distasteful, but there are going to be bloody towels found on the floor of the bathroom. None of this adds up. There was also a suicide note. There was a note left behind. But again, the style of the note didn't seem like that of Casolaro, who friends say was very more literary in terms of his writing, or his writing, not so much writing style, but in terms of his writing, in aspects of writing. That seemed rather flat. I mean, when you look at this stuff, stating that this guy was the victim of suicide makes no sense. It's ridiculous. Oh, I should also note that after the body was taken from the room, it was transported to a funeral home where he was embalmed. So, and he was also embalmed without his family's knowledge and approval.
Right.
They didn't find out about, 2 or 3 days afterwards, when his brother had called to find out about what had happened to his brother. He was told that they had already embalmed the body. I mean, again, you have to wonder, why would authorities there or anyone there decide to go and embalm a body so fast? Why would that be necessary in a random, I'll say, quote, random, straightforward suicide? Why? I mean, when you think about this, it doesn't add up. None of these details add up.
Right. Doesn't add up. And all of his notes, Casolaro's notes, are all on archive.org if people want to check them out. You can actually follow his leads and his notebook and his scribblings and all that stuff.
Of course, the notes he took with him are gone. He took notes with him to the hotel because, he took notes when he was there in Martinsburg. Those are gone. Whatever William Turner gave him, if Turner had given him any documents, those are gone. Again, you look up all of these aspects and you look at these, you can only conclude this man was murdered. But what's the story? The story is that this was, a suicide. That's what it was seen as at the time. Straightforward suicide.
Right. And there's pictures of his cuts on his arm, and they look fake. I mean, if those pictures are accurate.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if ever a death, and what was interesting about it is, when I was doing my research into this, his death was reported on by the New York Times, by the Washington Post, by Newsweek. Casolaro was not famous. He was not well known. He was a kind of very, how do I put this? He was a rather obscure freelance writer and I guess freelance journalist. So the New York Times does an article August 17th, 1991. Because he had died, I believe it was August 10th, 1991. New York Times does an article August 17, 1991. Their headline is, "Reporter is buried amid questions over his pursuit of conspiracy idea." Newsweek, when they looked at it, this is a quote staff article, right? No specific byline to this article. This came out, let's see here. It's August 25th. Their headline, "A Victim of the Octopus." So let's take a little look at what they thought. So, I've told you what the details, and I've told people out there what are the details in regards to the death of Danny Casolaro, and people can look up this themselves by looking up. For example, they can get some of the details, basic details. For example, I came across this uh, uh, this case many years ago by watching Unsolved Mysteries. It was the same thing with the death of Bobby Fuller, and this is where I first heard about this. And so again, planted a seed in my mind, and so later on, I got interested. I started digging up a little and doing research. So I know Unsolved Mysteries. They did a decent job in looking into Danny Casolaro. And if people want to get some basics about it, they can look up that episode. I know there are episodes of Unsolved Mysteries on YouTube. I think standalone episodes. So if they want to get a little taste of it, they can look that up. But New York Times headline is, reporter is buried amid questions over his pursuit of conspiracy idea. So for them, the octopus and what was going on was a conspiracy idea. Well, PROMIS was not a conspiracy idea. It was a software that was modified and it worked. It was not a conspiracy idea. What happened to the Hamiltons, having their contract basically voided and invalidated and not getting the rest of their money and being forced into bankruptcy, was not a conspiracy idea. Now, you could argue about the octopus, as Danny Casolaro called it, but we know even if you're a person that is not given into quote unquote conspiracy ideas, and I sure as hell am not, even people would have to contend, at least reasonable people would have to contend, that there are very murky and nebulous aspects of the intelligence world, of law enforcement, of aspects of government interacting with criminal personalities, with opportunists, with all kinds of other people. This exists. This kind of shadow world exists.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So conspiracy idea. But
almost applying the term conspiracy to this case it's not an accurate term. It's really uncovering this kind of global underworld. BCCI was real. Backdoor software is real. Hidden secret payments are real. Bribes, things like that. That's really, if you look at his notes, it's like somebody just looking into those darker parts, this underworld of the world at that time. And he's seeing connections. So he's seeing connections between above board, legit places like the Cabazon Indians were just a reservation. Somebody was using them, though, for dark purposes. Wackenhut clearly had, a hidden hand to it. So those are just things that are truths.
That's a very good way of responding to this. And I like that you put it that way, because applying the term conspiracy in this context, it waters down, it dilutes, it also insults. And I think the whole point is to get people away from what has gone on in regards to these aspects, right? To get their minds away from this nebulous sphere, this sort of shadowy world, all of these elements. These are spheres in which the public, which the general overall citizens, the average Joe, so to speak, don't like that term, but the average person, the average man and woman, this is all these spheres and all of these dark places are places where certain entities and certain power centers, I would call them, don't want people to go or don't want people to know.
Right.
And I like the way that you put that. I really like the way that you put that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just those things happen. They don't want some independent journalist exposing it. And so, I mean, you can look at Edward Snowden. He knows all the darker, or just supposedly does. But a lot of these whistleblowers know some of the deeper secrets that some of these powers don't want exposed. So it's not that surprising. Is there anything you'd like to add? We're at about an hour. I mean,
okay.
Is there anything else to add to this or finish it up? Or
oh, there's plenty to add.
Like what?
Well, I talked about the octopus, right? And that Casolaro believed it was this organization, this shadowy organization of former intelligence operatives, former people involved in alphabet agencies, as the term goes. Now, one aspect of the PROMIS affair that I guess should be noted has to do with a guy by the name of Robert Maxwell, right? Now, Robert Maxwell was a press baron. He was a man who had bought the Daily Mirror in about 1984 or so, in the 80s. And he was someone that got involved in PROMIS. And that's been one of the, I don't call this a rabbit hole or a series of rabbit holes. I actually call it, how do I put this? I call it the catacombs. All of these dark subterranean tunnels, which unfortunately have a lot of fatalities involved. So when you talk about, for example, what has gone on with aspects of INSLAW and PROMIS and the octopus, you're talking about a lot of deaths associated with it. And this is where the danger in this subject comes up. There have been a lot of people that were involved. And that's just why I said things seem to go wrong. Things seem to go wrong for the Hamiltons. Things seem to go wrong for Riconosciuto. Not to mention those people that were helping Riconosciuto. He had an attorney that died. He had, I believe it was someone helping out with Riconosciuto's case, die. I mean, the list of people that were found either dead of, quote, suicide or murder is significant and lengthy. And that's one of the disturbing elements when you look at what has gone on with this. I mean, that this is, again, I use the term dark, I use the term catacombs, right? That's deliberate because from what I understand, in the Paris catacombs, these were tunnels and parts of the city that were built over eventually, but that date back centuries, I believe. I believe there's a part of the catacombs where there are a bunch of skulls piled up. That's why I call this the catacombs, because of the amount of deaths associated with this, and the issues that are associated with this. So I did want to get into this because I know this was something you were interested in.
Yeah, if you know more information about Maxwell, go ahead and share it.
Okay. Well, Maxwell was, he's one of those permutations in regards to the PROMIS aspect. Now, as I mentioned before, PROMIS was basically, I'll be polite and say, obtained by the federal government, right? And what happened with the federal government was there was a guy, I talked about Riconosciuto. There was a guy by the name of Earl Bryan. He was a doctor. He had been a part of Ronald Reagan's kitchen cabinet in California when Ronald Reagan was governor of California. He had been I believe was the director of health in California, I guess in the 60s or 70s. And so Earl Bryan was reportedly involved with the Reagan-Bush campaign and the whole October surprise affair. Now, people don't know what October surprise is. to boil it down, it's essentially the belief by the Reagan-Bush campaign that if Jimmy Carter, who they were running against, Democrat Jimmy Carter, if he was able to get hostages, which were being held in Iran, these were former employees of the American embassy in Iran, which had been basically stormed by Iranians after the Iranian Revolution that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power in 1979. Excuse me. And they had been held for a number of months, for quite a long time. Here in the was their release. It will give him a jump in the polls and will get him reelected. Thus, the October surprise, last minute. So what the Reagan-Bush team ostensibly was involved with was trying to delay the release of the hostages. And so Earl Bryan was supposedly involved as one of the intermediaries in helping to delay the release of the hostages until after the 1980 election. And reportedly, as part of efforts in this regards, and we know that Reagan efforts in this regard, Earl Bryan supposedly was allowed to take the PROMIS software and sell it. So that's precisely what the first sort of salesman around the world is selling it around the world.
Your connections, you're losing. I'm losing you. Yeah, your connection's going out.
A company called Hadron Technology.
So this is what happened. He, according to the book,
Bryan
The Assassination
had
of
established
Robert
a
Maxwell, Israel's super spy.
His company.
What really happened was, according to the assassination of Robert Maxwell, Israel's super spy, Maxwell was an agent for the Mossad. He had a relationship where he arranged for a copy of PROMIS to be sold to Sandia National Laboratories, which granted access to Israeli intelligence, giving them nuclear details. And then there was, Maxwell was working with John Tower, who died in a plane crash. So there was a lot of things going on with PROMIS, so that had security and national, intel implications, a lot of things. So PROMIS wasn't some kind of like, benign software. It was a backdoor. Things were being sold. Maxwell was involved in the sale of PROMIS. And I think that his daughter actually was involved in some other software as well. So I think she was doing something like that. Let's see. Yeah, according to my notes, but yeah, he was involved in it. Let's see if Albert, are you there?
Yeah.
Albert, are you there? Okay. You were going in and out.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, good.
Oh, no, I'm here.
Yeah, your connection isn't great. Your connection was going out. That's what happened. So it's probably why you didn't see it. So why don't you just take some time, wrap this up, and then, if we do a part 2, maybe you can get a better connection or something. Hello? Yeah, your connection still isn't good. So anyway, there's probably more to the story. There's definitely more to Robert Maxwell, but we'll just follow up with a part 2 if we can figure out more, and maybe Albert can get a better connection. So I will put Albert's contact information and his new YouTube channel in the show notes for audio listeners. But thank you so much for your time, Albert. 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. I think he's gone. All right. Thank you. Bye, guys.
Oh, thank you for having me.